You spent your entire childhood protecting the wrong parent. You defended them. You believed every word they said. You cut off the other parent because you thought you were making your own choice, thought you were protecting yourself. But what if I told you that the parent you believed was saving you from harm was actually the one destroying you? And the parent you rejected, the one you were convinced didn't love you, was the only one telling the truth. There's a moment that happens in therapy, usually decades too late, when adults realize they were weaponized as children, when they discover that the parent they thought was the victim was actually the abuser, and the years they lost with the other parent weren't because that parent didn't want them, but because someone they trusted made sure they'd never know the truth. And that realization doesn't just hurt, it shatters everything you thought you knew about your own childhood, your own memories, your own choices. Maybe you grew up hearing one parent constantly criticize the other. Maybe you were told stories about how terrible that parent was, how they didn't really love you, how they abandoned you or hurt you or didn't want to see you. And over time, you started to believe it. You started to feel uncomfortable around that parent. You started making excuses not to visit, and eventually you rejected them completely, convinced it was your own decision. But here's what psychology has discovered about this pattern that most people don't recognize until it's too late. When one parent systematically destroys a child's relationship with the other parent through manipulation, false narratives, and psychological conditioning, that's not protection. That's parental alienation, and it's one of the most damaging forms of psychological abuse a child can experience. I'm Sergiu Popovici, and this is Psychology by Sergiu Popovici. Let me start by explaining what parental alienation actually is, because it's not the same as a child having legitimate reasons to avoid a parent. Understanding this distinction is critical. Parental alienation occurs when one parental figure uses strategies to harm or destroy the relationship between a child and the other parent. And the outcome is a psychological condition in which a child allies themselves strongly with the alienating parent and rejects a relationship with the targeted parent without legitimate justification. The key phrase here is, without legitimate justification. We're not talking about situations where a parent is genuinely abusive, neglectful, or dangerous, and a child reasonably wants distance. We're talking about situations where a loving, capable parent is systematically erased from a child's life through psychological manipulation by the other parent. Research shows this is far more common than most people realize, using estimation procedures based on divorced families and high-conflict situations. Approximately 1% of all children are alienated from a parental figure to some degree. And the prevalence of parents who feel they are targets of these behaviors is much higher. The alienating parent uses specific psychological tactics that are remarkably consistent across cases. Understanding these tactics helps explain how a child can be convinced to reject a parent they once loved. One of the most common strategies is what psychologists call bad-mouthing or denigration, where the alienating parent makes repeated negative comments about the targeted parent, criticizing their character, their parenting, their motivations, often in front of the child or in ways the child will overhear. This isn't occasional frustration or venting. This is systematic programming where the child is exposed to a constant narrative that the other parent is bad, untrustworthy, unloving, or dangerous, and over time, these messages become the child's own beliefs, even though they're based on distortion rather than reality. Another tactic is limiting or blocking contact between the child and the targeted parent, creating excuses why visits can't happen, scheduling conflicting activities during the other parent's time, making communication difficult, or even moving to a different location to create physical distance. Some alienating parents move to different states or even overseas, making a relationship or even communication with the targeted parent difficult, and children later report being told that the targeted parent didn't love them or didn't want to see them when the opposite was true. The alienating parent may also share inappropriate information with the child about the divorce, financial issues, or alleged wrongdoings of the other parent. Positioning the child as a confidant or ally in adult conflicts they're not emotionally equipped to process. This creates what psychologists call parentification, where the child feels responsible for taking care of the alienating parent emotionally. And this emotional burden makes it even harder for the child to maintain a relationship with the targeted parent because it feels like a betrayal of the parent who needs them. Research has identified that the alienating parent often displays specific personality characteristics. Perceptions of the alienating parent included being self-absorbed, critical, and lacking in empathy and insight into how their behavior impacts others, even when confronted by their child. What makes parental alienation particularly insidious is that it operates through the child's own psychology. The alienating parent doesn't just prevent contact. They reshape how the child thinks and feels about the targeted parent. So the rejection feels like it's coming from the child rather than being imposed on them. Over time, the child may genuinely believe they have their own reasons for rejecting the targeted parent. They may construct memories or interpretations of events that support the alienating parent's narrative. And they may become defensive or even hostile if anyone suggests their beliefs might have been influenced. This is why parental alienation is so difficult to address. The child doesn't see themselves as a victim of manipulation. They see themselves as making informed choices to protect themselves from a parent who the alienating parent has convinced them is harmful. Now, let's talk about the long-term consequences of parental alienation. Because this isn't just about missing a parent during childhood. This is about psychological damage that extends well into adulthood. Research conducted by psychologists at the University of Tasmania with adult participants who had a history of parental alienation revealed 7 major themes showing the breadth and depth of effects well into adulthood. All participants experienced mental health issues ranging from anxiety and PTSD to suicidal ideation, which they traced to their alienating parents' abuse, and many reported having low self-esteem, low confidence in themselves and their abilities, and some disclosed using alcohol and drugs from an early age to cope. The damage extends into their adult relationships. Participants described having difficulties across friendships and romantic relationships, including difficulty trusting, fear of losing relationships, and often choosing partners that were as abusive as their alienating parent. Participants felt different from and unable to confide their experience with other children, had difficulty believing that someone would support them, and struggled to maintain healthy relationships due to lack of positive role models and poor relationship skills. There's also profound damage to identity and development, being told that the targeted parent was bad. Children were conscious of the ways they were like that parent and felt shame about it. And most had difficulty with learning and focusing on school, feeling blocked from fulfilling their academic potential because the alienating parent's needs came before their own. And perhaps most heartbreaking, many alienated children eventually recognize what happened to them as adults. They reach out to the targeted parent and discover that everything they were told was false, that the parent they rejected actually loved them and fought to maintain contact, and they're left dealing with profound guilt, grief over lost years, and rage at the parent who manipulated them. What's particularly tragic is that research shows the importance of intervening and supporting children and families exposed to parental alienating behaviors, because many participants said they wish they had received support earlier. Now, I want to address something critical about how parental alienation is perceived in psychology and law, because there's significant controversy around this topic that affects whether children receive help. The term parental alienation syndrome was introduced by psychiatrist Richard Gardner in the 1980s, but the syndrome terminology has been heavily criticized and is not recognized in diagnostic manuals like the DSM, and this has led some people to dismiss the entire concept as invalid. However, recent comprehensive reviews of empirical studies on parental alienation show that of more than 200 studies reviewed, 40% were published since 2016, meaning that many earlier reviews arguing the research was in its infancy are now outdated. This research leaves no doubt that parental alienation is a valid concept supported by a robust and well-developed scientific literature. And professional organizations, including the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, have recognized the existence and harmful effects of parental alienation. The current approach in most professional settings is to focus on parental alienating behaviors rather than diagnosing a syndrome, which allows courts and therapists to address the harmful actions without getting caught in debates about terminology. Research has also challenged some common misconceptions about who engages in alienating behavior. 10 studies found no gender differences in who was likely to be an alienating parent, and 10 other studies found that while more mothers than fathers were identified as the alienating parent, fathers still constituted a significant minority of alienating parents. In other words, both mothers and fathers can be alienating parents, and both mothers and fathers can be targeted parents. This is not inherently a gender-specific phenomenon, despite how it's sometimes portrayed. So how do you recognize if you experienced parental alienation as a child, especially if you're now an adult trying to make sense of your childhood and your relationship with your parents? Ask yourself whether one parent consistently portrayed the other parent in an extremely negative light. Whether you were exposed to adult information about the divorce or conflicts that you shouldn't have been privy to as a child. Whether contact with one parent was frequently disrupted or made difficult through various excuses. Consider whether you felt pressure to choose sides, whether you were made to feel that loving both parents was a betrayal, whether one parent seemed to need you to reject the other parent to prove your loyalty. Look at whether your memories of the targeted parent match the reality now that you're older, whether the things you believed about them as a child turn out to have been exaggerations, distortions, or complete fabrications. And pay attention to how you feel when you consider reconnecting with a parent you rejected. There's profound guilt, confusion about why you cut them off, or a sense that your childhood beliefs don't align with what you understand now. These may be signs that you were manipulated. If you recognize this pattern in your own history, understand that what happened to you was a form of psychological abuse, and the fact that you rejected the targeted parent doesn't mean your two blamed children cannot be held responsible for the beliefs that adults systematically instilled in them. Healing from parental alienation often requires processing grief for the years lost, working through guilt about your role in the estrangement, even though you were the victim, and carefully considering whether it's safe and healthy to attempt reconnection with the targeted parent. Many adults who were alienated as children do successfully rebuild relationships with their targeted parents, and find that having that parent back in their life helps heal some of the damage, though it doesn't erase the years that were lost. It also often requires confronting the reality that the alienating parent caused serious harm, which is complicated because that parent may still be in your life and you may have mixed feelings about them. You can acknowledge that they damaged you while also recognizing that your relationship with them is more complex than simple villainy. If you're currently witnessing parental alienation happening to a child you know, to understand that this is serious psychological harm that requires intervention. The child may seem like they're making their own choices, but children are not equipped to resist sophisticated psychological manipulation by a parent they depend on. The most important thing to understand is that parental alienation is real. It's documented, it's harmful, and it's far more common than most people realize. And recognizing it for what it is, psychological abuse that destroys families, is the first step toward addressing it. If this video resonated with you, subscribe to Psychology by Sergio Popovici and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the psychological patterns that shape and sometimes damage our lives. Leave a comment below if you've experienced parental alienation. Either as the alienated child or as the targeted parent, your story might help someone else finally understand what they went through and know they're not alone. Thank you for watching, and remember, if someone had to convince you to hate a parent who loved you, you were the victim of manipulation, not the author of your own choices. I'll see you in the next one.